Welcome to Delta F, where we explain space power by exploring the differences between fiction and fact, and investigating the mission behind the memes. I'm happy today to be kicking off a new round of content for the Space Force Association. We're really going to spend some time using some of the more interesting things like science fiction to actually learn real lessons about what's going on in the Space Force and maybe what should be going on in national space power writ large. I think the takeaway would be that the Space Force Association aims to not just be your grandfather's professional organization. We want to be fun and dynamic, and there's really valid reasons for that, because the Space Force is not like the Air Force in 1947 after it had won a war and built up to hundreds of thousands of people in airplanes. It's a lot more like national air power in the 1920s or 1930s, when we hadn't figured out an airway system and we didn't have confident forms of navigation, and we didn't have policy in place on how to certify pilots and airplanes. So there's a lot of work to be done. And this is just going to be some fun ways to have some of those conversations. So specifically today, I'm really excited to kick off that effort by talking to the authors of a really cool book, To Boldly Go, which is a fantastic collection of essays. Thank you very much. Yeah, I could hold up my iPad because I read the digital version. And so real quick, I want to introduce the authors and then get right into talking about the book. So with us today is Colonel John Klug, who has contributed in a long variety of professional writing and taught at more than one service academy, and Mr. Steve Leonard, who is kind of famous on the internet as the Doctrine Man. So gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell me just real quick, a tiny bit of background, what brought the two of you together to write a book? And then we'll talk specifically about what book you chose to write.
Oh, I can start. John and I have been friends for 20 years, almost 20 years. And we've actually done a lot together in other forms. We worked together. So this was just kind of a natural evolution. I don't remember if we ever had a conversation about that we should do this. It's just the idea came up and we were just going to do it. And you know, I don't even think we gave it 5 minutes of discussion. We're like, yeah, we're going to do this. Okay. And then off we went. And, you know, what you see in front of you or what John showed, you know, that's the final product of just, you know, 20 years of going back and forth and then having it all come together in the matter of a pandemic year.
Yeah, I think, you know, Steve, you mentioned, you know, when you had sat with Mick about this, you know, the actual project itself, but you know, I mean, it's just for those of us who enjoy fiction and enjoy not only this genre but others. You watch certain shows, whether it's science fiction or, you know, Game of Thrones or something like that, and you watch how in that setting, in those different universes, how people wrestle with leadership, how people wrestle with strategic problems, and even how people wrestle with tactical problems. It just becomes kind of a natural thing for those of us who've wrestled with these problems for so long to put that together and then think, you know, that what they did there, that just inspires me to think about this. Or, you know, the end of the last Game of Thrones season, I would never have done it like that. I would have done this or that. I mean, it just naturally, I think, comes out.
So I think one of the first things as I was reading the introduction is it was really interesting to just tap on what is science fiction. So I'll kind of cue it up, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe even how you scoped the topics you wanted to put in the book, or just personally what you think is science fiction or not, to scope the conversation. So, you know, according to the giant Google machines, which probably spit me directly to Wikipedia, science fiction is a form of fiction that deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon individuals. And then I dug a little deeper and I found that, you know, if you pull 5-10 different definitions of science fiction, the word that shows up the most is speculative. So it kind of made me think of Heinlein's approach to fiction, where he liked to take a relatively recognizable world and change one thing, and then start pulling on that thread and figuring out, well, what does that teach me? How many different things could I do and how differently would I handle situations if I had that one tool, that one MacGuffin, or if this one strategic situation happened differently?
I'm not sure that we explicitly ever discussed a definition of science fiction. I don't know what you think, Steve. I think that we took the approach. It was a very broad source to tap into. I don't think we ever set any boundaries.
So John's being really humble. What John really means to say is that he was the driving force behind the introduction to the book, where we start to lay out the thinking and use Ray Bradbury Theater as kind of the platform to launch into the subject matter. That's all John. We may not have talked directly about what science fiction was, but John was the impetus behind that vision of, that kind of ties into what you said, Blade, that, what it was that we were trying to get to, that whole literature of ideas thing. That's all John. Being very humble when he shouldn't be. But I mean, he owned that part. He set the vision for what we were going to do early on. And then after that, we just kind of said, well, what are the things that we need to talk about? And obviously, we want to talk about leadership, because you can't really talk science fiction without the great captains of science fiction. And you have to talk to great captains. And then there's the strategic piece of things. And there's so many different varieties to pick from. The strategy that drives what people do, the conflict inherent in almost all forms of science fiction. It's very rare to find science fiction, a piece that's not built around some form of conflict. The introduction of diversity to science fiction was absolutely, it's an easy topic to talk about, because it starts with aliens, and the aliens are representative of our own culture, whether we realize it or not. And then we start to tease in those ideas. And then, of course, my personal favorite was the last part, where we get to talk toxic leadership, which is a favorite topic of mine. But it's also an ever-present factor within science fiction. You've got Khan, you've got your, pick your prototypical bad guy. There is a toxic individual somewhere in that story that ends up being the antagonist, and they're great. I mean, nobody's better than Khan, obviously, but Darth Vader comes to mind. And so you have all that richness to talk about, and then these are things that we deal with professionally on a regular basis. So it's really easy to wrap that back up and then contextualize it in a way that is broadly appealing to audiences. And I think that's where, we took the Ray Bradbury Theater piece and then just pushed forward from there.
I'd be curious, John, what's your thought on who you wrote the book for? What's the primary audience? Because I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about what I think Guardians should be getting out of it. But I'd love to hear, who you were aiming it at in the first place.
It does appeal to, like you said, maybe half a dozen chapters, or if you're really, quietly a huge geek, it might be a dozen or 2 dozen of the chapters. But the point there is we'd hope that there would be at least half a dozen chapters that would speak to any one individual who's reading the book. And I think that's really the strength of it. And that could be, as you alluded to, it could be something that you're familiar with, right? Whether it's Dune or it's Star Trek or what have you, or maybe it's the topic. Like Steve mentioned, toxic leadership. If you weren't a Star Trek fan, I hope that chapter on Khan as a toxic leader is accessible enough to where you can look at the story and think through and go, yep, I can see the descent of this person who was, granted a broken moral compass kind of leader to begin with, a dictator, but the descent down through to becoming a more and more toxic leader as circumstances drive. So again, I think we tried to make it accessible, but also hope that, like you said, maybe there'd be half a dozen chapters that someone would be really interested in.
Yeah, and I think I'd say to anybody that's watching that I find that to be really true. Almost every time a character is introduced, there's enough attention paid to kind of recapping the major plot points or the major background of that character or situation to make it comprehensible, even if you don't get the specific reference. Now, that said, let's make it fun for just a second. So before I even read anything other than the introduction, the first thing I did is I started searching for my favorite science fiction in the book. So first off, congratulations, you covered all the bases. You named it: Star Trek, Star Wars, Dune, they're all in there. And the result's great, but one title I answered, just the title. What's missing, Steve? What do you wish?
Foundation. The one piece I wanted to write about was Foundation. I wanted to do Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and talk to it within the context of strategy. But I just, John and I can only write so much and edit so much, and I didn't want to squeeze one more chapter in.
I love that. I immediately think about the challenges of perfect foresight versus making decisions based on imperfect information. John, what one fiction would you insert into the book if you could just be Q and snap your fingers?
Robotech, aliens, and I just had one more, but Robotech probably the one that would make the most sense for this particular book. But as far as other genres that we didn't cover that somehow I wish we had, would have been aliens and I mentioned this earlier, kaiju, Godzilla of some way.
Okay, that's a good transition. So I wanted to ask one question, and then I'm going to specifically get after Godzilla. So the one question is, we've been kind of dancing around the value of science fiction to a military professional, and larger to anybody kind of philosophically doing, meta thinking about the world. But what do you think about the value of aspirational versus dystopian science fiction? What is hey, that's a thing we should build towards because that looks like it works, versus the cautionary tale?
So here's where I come down on this one. This is one I talk about a lot. And you have your choice of futures. Do you want the bicentennial man kind of iRobot, Asimov robot future of artificial intelligence, or hey, behind door B we have Terminators? Which one do you want? And because we always talk about AI and everybody always points towards, oh my God, this is how we end up with Terminators and the rise of the machines and the world dies. It's like, that's a movie, right? It's not real. But I love that. To compare the two. I'm much more a believer in aspirational science fiction, but in the same vein, I like the dystopian stuff too. I'm drawn to it and I can't get away from it.
John, any different thoughts?
For some reason, it's reminding me of Gene Roddenberry's displeasure with The Wrath of Khan, because it was a different kind of movie than Gene, different spin on Star Trek than you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Like Steve, I'm torn. The Terminator. I'll even throw Mad Max. Road Warrior in there. I mean, this circles back to what you talked about, the definition of science fiction. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of the dystopian side of things. Obviously with what's been going on in the world over the last 5 years, decade, 2 decades, we've seen more and more of this. How science fiction is reflecting the fears of a lot of folks. But I'll throw this out too. We were thinking about Space Force, and maybe we can circle back on it, but perhaps for your community, the best source of where we're at, our challenges where we're at presently might be the early James Bond movies.
I would like to ask one more question about the book before we get into like a couple of really cool things that I think we can pull out of the book. I want to talk about the content. And that's just, is there anything interesting about the process? And in particular, the thing I want to know is, how'd you land on the title? Those particular words that are clearly evocative specifically of Star Trek, how did those fit the purpose?
I have a background in strategic communications, and a lot of times those things just come to me. And that was the title. Before we had anything else done, I'm like, this thing has a title. It's got to be called To Boldly Go, because that not only hits the aspirational part of this, It's also something immediately recognizable. You say "to boldly go," and you will immediately get people's attention.
To boldly go where no one has gone before.
The hardest part was the subtitle. I mean, we probably spent months on the subtitle, but hey, the main title, 2 minutes and we're done. We had it. Just boom, just like that.
Well, so to recap then, the subtitle being Leadership Strategy and Conflict in the 21st Century and Beyond.
And beyond.
Fantastic. Buzz Lightyear would be proud. Let's talk a little bit about what's actually in the book. I'd like to do this in two parts. And if we're running out of time, we'll just do it faster. But I'd like to talk about some things in sort of the first half of the book where I thought there were some really great lessons. And I just kind of want to go through a couple of those. And then the second part, I'd like to talk more specifically about a couple of the ones that you gentlemen wrote yourselves. So go into sort of the work of your team. You've got a great piece called "You're Not Ender Wiggin, and That's Okay." And I thought that was fantastic. It talks a fair bit about the risks of drawing lessons from fiction. So it's almost like early in the book, you take a minute to go, hey, before we go too far, let's just remember this is fiction. It's written by people who may or may not have done their research, may or may not have a background that's relevant in the area. And so let's look at that through a critical lens. Is the technology or the situation, the context realistic? What's the probability these things would happen? And if not those things, how applicable is the lesson I could draw from this to something real? So I really like that. And I wanted to take a minute and point out that I don't think that's unique to science fiction either. You literally read a military or a political history, and you better definitely acknowledge that objective truth is not there in the lessons, right? You can know an event, but to understand the impact of that and how you apply it to the future requires your own critical insight. So I think there's a great quote that you threw right in there that I think came from Dune. So Frank Herbert that said, quote, "Beware of heroes, much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes." So what do you think? Going through the entire book, is it fair to look at these articles with a sense of that's a real interesting observation? Here's maybe the different lesson I would take from it.
Oh, I think that's the idea. That's really what you want. You want the authors to convey lessons, to convey ideas, but at the same time, you apply your own critical mind to it, and you pull things out. People are going to pull different things out, and it's one of the things that we talked about when we talked about audiences was, yeah, there's a military audience component to this, but when we sold the idea to a publisher, I think business leaders are going to get something out of this. People I work with are already reading it, and it's going to be beyond that. And the science fiction fans are going to pull their own thoughts out of it. And if you get a bunch of people in a room who have read this and then hear them start to argue, it's fascinating. We want people to pull things out of here and then argue about it. And hey, no, Ender didn't know what he was talking about. Ender was just a kid, or sandworms are going to come up and get you one way or another, and you're not going to be able to escape them. You want that kind of discourse. You want people to get excited and talk about the book, because then the rest of us, we just, like John, I mean, we'll sit back and go, yeah, that's what we got. We got the exact effect we were aiming for, which was just discussion.
We often look at idols, like the specifically we're talking about the Ender Wiggin chapter here. We look at idols, we look at great people, we listen to their stories, they're interviewed by journalists, but we always have to be careful listening to their stories about how they stuck to it, and they kept practicing and they kept doing it, and you can be successful too. Well, maybe not. Michael Jordan has gifts that many people won't have, and it won't matter how long you stay in the gym shooting 2 and 3 pointers, right? It won't matter. So I think that's an interesting point just for that particular chapter to draw forth, and I think that that's a hard lesson that everybody has to learn at some point in life, some earlier than others. And sometimes in different aspects of life.
Princess Leia and the Strategic Art of, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Metis or Metis. It's Greek to me. literally.
Right.
Miss Gregg wrote this piece, and I thought for sure, especially based on the first paragraph, this is going to be a piece about diversity in the military. But the article actually didn't even spend much time on that. Went right into this great idea of the Greek feminine ideal of Athena being captured in Metis, vice, again, pronunciation, Bia, or this concept of is what matters tactical excellence and might, aka winning the battle, or the more strategic mindset of understanding how deception and posturing and understanding the strategic intent and of you and your adversaries is more key to victory. And the examples pull from Battlestar Galactica and the Empire, and I found that great. So I was kind of curious if you had a thought, because I thought that theme actually came up in some of the other articles.
You're the first person of any interviews that we have done. You were the first person to pull that out. Even though John and I have talked about this repeatedly, months we talked about this. And those are the little things that I think are so important about the book, that you capture those kinds of things. And you said something else that really struck me, and that's the, going forward, the openness and equity of Space Force, and how I think the fact that it's so new gives it an opportunity to blaze a trail that hasn't really been blazed from the outset, which is to say, hey, we are going to define who we are from day one, and nobody's going to define us. And I think for the Space Force, it's 1946, and you're the Air Force, and you realize that the future means you've got to be away from the Army. So you've got to be on your own. You've got to break that tether and say, hey, Major Blade to ground control, here we go.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Man, now we're getting into it. Yours is the superior experience, intellect, and the Battle of the Mutara Nebula. This is the piece that you collaborated on, right? So this is to me, kind of the beating heart of the book. It's one of the strong pieces. It covers a lot of ground. It talks Greek again, phronesis, I think, you described it as a more experience-based form of learning that transcends the confines of teaching. But I'm just going to go straight to it. You talked a lot about Khan as an example of a great intellect who lacked experience that was relevant to the particular conflict, because he's sort of out of his time, out of his domain in a way. There's probably a whole lot to pull on there. Versus Kirk, who is just a mortal man, but has a full Starfleet career on the bridge, understands everything. So what do you think about that? So not so much the experience versus inexperience, or experience versus intellect, but the depth of knowledge required to win in any battle in the context of the domain, your weapon, and the threat.
That could have been an entire chapter by itself. You could have recast that entire chapter around being a master of your domain and the expertise required to master your domain. Because you're right. Kirk was the master of his domain. He was surrounded by people with just a wealth of experience fighting in that domain. Operating in that domain, and Khan wasn't. Khan didn't. You can be the smartest man in the room, but if you don't have that knowledge, that experience, that help me out, John, but that expertise, you're lost.
Here's an interesting point, right? Khan's a genius. He was an expert on the Enterprise. He became an expert on the Enterprise by accessing the computer, so on and so forth. When you're comparing these things, right? The Battle of Mutara Nebula, and I like your point, but first off, we got to look. You got technical experts, but then it's the employment. It's that next part. It's the creative part. I'm not sure that Khan would have ever been that creative, but just to take a step back for a moment, he's not a master of the domain, as you said. He's a technical master. He's a master of the ship. He understands it. Obviously with his targeting of the Enterprise, he understands the Enterprise. So he understands that part of it. But where he doesn't, where it falls apart, we've already talked about, is the three-dimensional part. Now, if you just watched a little bit of the 2004 era Battlestar Galactica with the Dratus system, he would have started to understand that you need to think in 3 dimensions.
Timothy Choi's article, where no port has gone before, not only took the Star Trek conversation right to where it started to get really interesting, which is Deep Space Nine, but it's exceptionally poignant for the Space Force. So what do you think? What is the role of the maritime strategy that Timothy Choi talks about and where no port has gone before to today's Space Force?
One of the things we talked about is metaphor. That's kind of what we're getting at here. In is space more like naval power, or is it more like air power? When I say that, I'm saying Billy Mitchell kind of air power. And then, I think it gets at a very important point, which is you mentioned already, the Lagrange points, which I find fascinating for some silly reason. The farther we get from our own, farther we get from Terra, the more it starts to resemble the Navy, the maritime aspect. The closer we are, well, essentially when we're in our own gravity well, it seems to have much more in common with air power.
I want to skip ahead real quick. We're now in a totally different section of the book. Flag follows trade, a cautionary tale from the Expanse. And I'm going to be completely honest. Why am I bringing this one up? Partly, I should have talked about this right after we talked about Deep Space Nine, because to me, it's very much a continuation of that idea of science fiction that can really give us some illustrations about what's going on, what is likely to happen in the space domain in the future. And the big compelling question is sort of, will the flag get planted and then civil activities like an economy follow, as happened to a certain extent in the westward expanse that I described earlier? It's happened historically in a lot of places, military. I mean, the exploration of the Americas, all of the ugly sides of colonization and empire aside, were military expeditions that then, followed through with economic benefit and eventually social. And the posit is, or there's a counterexample in history. The East India Company, that was chartered, but was ultimately a private entity and just went out, for lack of a better word, rape and pillage. And the British flag followed behind. The takeaway on that was sort of twofold for me, is that, hey, that situation that we're in now, where it's billionaires setting their own objectives in space that are as bold as colonize another planet, are in a way setting where we're going and when we're going. And then governments are trying to figure out policies around that and missions that will follow up, almost more than leading the way.
Personally, I would say it's almost better to have the flag planted first and then follow. And I think history, and you use the East India Company as an example, as Teresa did in the chapter. I think that's a cautionary example, because if private industry is what goes out to colonize the galaxy, then it's going to be done differently, and policy and law will always follow behind. And we saw how the East India Company operated, and some of the we were still dealing with that economical colonization, the backlash from that still today. Not saying it would happen in space, but it could. It could also drive conflict in a way that we don't have control over. And I think that's where the Expanse is a good example of that. You want to have control over the exertion of violence wherever it happens. You don't want to turn space into the Wild West. And if we allow private industry to be what, say, colonizes and then pillages Mars or whatever planet's next, that's problematic. And it's problematic for us as a people, as a world, as a government. John, I don't know if John agrees or disagrees, but it's one of those things that you don't have a solid answer to, but there's two examples of what we can do. And, the government's not going to move that fast. Private industry is clearly moving that fast. Do we need to rein some of that in? Do we need to catch up? And I don't know what the right answer is, but it's definitely something we have to think about before it becomes a problem that we have to solve.
I think it's interesting the way you pose that challenge. The question, so if you're correct and the assumption is it makes sense for a flag to be there, and I think I'd recap to say that you sort of said, if private efforts lead, justice will lag. There will be problems before there is a government to adjudicate. And I think the second point that you made is you face the risk of forfeiting the government monopoly on legal violence. And those are really interesting strategic questions. So if those are true, and therefore we should let a flag lead or at least be at pace, you posed, do we need to rein in commerce until policy and government efforts can catch up? Or does the United States government need to move faster?
Yeah. Those are hard questions to ask and answer.
There are a lot of parallels here. I mean, UNCLOS, for the UN Charter on Law of the Sea, or whatever it stands for. I'm having brain lock. But we don't have anything like that for space. The last agreement that we had was early Cold War on space. And I think Steve's absolutely right. And of course, to digress for a moment, makes me think of Eddie Izzard. Do you have a flag? You have to, right. You have to, I think you have to do it that way for some of the things that Steve outlined. If we have not thought through the legal pieces of it, I mean, what was it? Elon Musk's Netflix, just sort of, I don't know what you would call that, a faux documentary about the colonization of Mars. If you haven't watched that, that really gets at these problems, which is, landing colonies on Mars. Those initial first couple colonies, are they government run? Or are they corporate? The frictions that evolve between the different colonies, one being more driven by profit than exploration. I think that it does a great job of exploring these challenges. The other part of, I think all that gets back to, again, Mahan. When he talks about colonies, it's the same. And by the way, the merchant marine part of it, it's an easy extrapolation to think about it from, in the sense of spacecraft of different kinds. So a lot of these problems rhyme in a historical sense.
Gentlemen, we have been at this for a minute, and I want to do one last thing. And that last thing is just to kind of look you straight in the eye and say, okay, so you're talking to every Guardian out there. What classic science fiction should they go back and read or watch? One each.
Oh, sure. I'll go back where we started 2 hours ago, which was the Foundation trilogy from Isaac Asimov. I think that is, as a people, not just as a Space Force, as a people, it's a great template for an aspirational vision of what the future should be, and then charting a path to achieve that aspirational vision. And I think that what drives Space Force to the future has to be aspirational and relatable. And I think if Harry Seldon was a real person, the guy who charted psychohistory, he would be right there next to the Guardians of Space Force, saying, "Okay, let's set an azimuth to the future."
This might seem like the easy button, right? But it's probably The Expanse. The first couple books when we're really dealing with inside the solar system. So I think that's where I got to come down. Those other two have some tidbits and some things that are interesting, but yeah, I'd have to go with The Expanse.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much. And I mean that for your time taking this interview, for sharing of your experience as well as your intellect to Guardians and all of the volunteers and members of America writ large that might watch this. but also specifically for writing the book. I sincerely believe, as I've digested that, it is a beautiful catalyst for conversations that need to be happening, all the way from how do we stop building toxic leaders and start building an aspirational vision for the Space Force. And that's an inside the Space Force and an outside of the Space Force challenge, all the way down to how do we think about the doctrine of controlling the space domain, both for terrestrial support and for the next couple of centuries of what we can't even begin to imagine is going to pan out economically and socially as we move human beings and human activities out beyond Earth orbit. Delta F is a production of the Space Force Association. SFA is a private entity, and the views expressed in this content don't represent those of the United States Space Force and have not been endorsed by any part of the federal government. On behalf of our production team and guests, thanks a lot for watching. If you like this video, please take a moment to like, subscribe, follow, and share. If you have feedback on the program, please leave a comment down below or engage with us on most major social media platforms.